coming out of the severe recession we had. Unfortunately, this is the economy we ended up with. And it's only because things were so bad for so long that even this mediocre recovery could be touted as something good. Well, I hope you like it because it's going to continue. We're going to continue to have slow growth in 2013, but the recovery should continue unless the federal government does something incredibly stupid. Now, I know it's hard to believe that would ever happen, but, you know, let's talk about two things. The fiscal cliff, they haven't even really addressed it, all right? And in that regard, it's causing great uncertainty. If you're in business and you don't know what your costs are going to be, you're going to pull back on things, and that's what's going on. Now, with the fiscal cliff, keep your eye on the ball. And the ball is a plan to get the deficit reduced, okay? It's not about taxes. It's not about how do you get the deficit reduced. We're going to go into this in a minute. And again, what was just passed, they have these fancy names, the American Taxpayer Relief Act. Actually, if you believe the government's numbers, will reduce the deficit by $737 billion. That's great, except even Obama admits you need $4 trillion, and the number's probably closer to 6 or 7, because what they're ignoring is that interest on the debt is about a quarter of what would normally be under normal interest rates. So the deficit is actually really understated considerably. So we're only about 12 or 15% of our way there. The other thing that has a problem is Obamacare, because nobody knows what it's going to cost, and nobody knows about the implementation. And because of that, again, there's a great deal of uncertainty, and people are less likely to hire. So we'll see what happens. In the meantime, this is the GDP over the last 44 years. You're not going to be tested on this, except you can see that this recovery has been slow. And obviously, there was a slight decline in the fourth quarter GDP, but we'll probably continue to grow, but we're going to grow slowly. And again, we'll go into some detail on this. Consumer spending is going to be up modestly because you're getting some additional jobs and hours worked. Business spending is going to be up. You have some excess industrial capacity, which means there's not going to be a lot of money spent on plant. The housing recovery should continue in earnest. Huge percentage gains, small numerical gains, because you're working from such a small base. Limited commercial construction. There'll be some pressure on state and local governments, but not quite as bad. And the federal government, is sort of out of policy options. Let's talk about consumers first. The good news here is that consumers have paid down $1.7 trillion in debt over the last 4 years. This is a financial obligations ratio. This is how much people pay for previously accumulated debt. Obviously, the more you're paying for previously accumulated debt, the less money you have now to spend. Well, we're back to levels that were first hit in 1982. So we've really gone a long way. Some of that's interest rates, but if you take a look at debt overall, consumers paid down more debt in this cycle than they have since the numbers were kept, and the expansion of debt has been very modest by historic standards. So consumers have restructured, better financial shape. They'll have ability to spend if they get some confidence. You have jobs growing. Jobs are growing slowly, but at least they're growing. And hours worked are growing, so there's not only people working more, they're working longer. That's all good news. The problem seems to be consumer confidence. We are at levels now which historically have been associated with the bottoms of recessions, not the early parts of recoveries. The recovery is 42 months old at this point, so it's not even the early part of recovery. Consumers are still kind of nervous, with good reason. One of the reasons they're nervous is something called the wealth effect. People tend to spend about 5 cents of every dollar of increased wealth, meaning the equity in their house and the stock market profits over about a 3-year period. So when the economy is booming, stock market's going way up, housing prices are going way up, people feel better, they spend more. And they spend more than their incomes would justify. Well, housing prices are starting to go up, and the stock market's obviously up from a year ago. This is good news. But see where we are in terms of household equity, from basically owner's equity in their house. It's way down, and that's really been a drag on the economy. Overall, we're almost getting back to where we were at the peak in household net worth. When we get above that, I think you'll see consumers loosen their purse strings. So overall, consumers really aren't in bad shape. Jobs, are being created at a slow rate, but they're being created. People are going to spend a little more, but they're going to remain cautious. Unemployment's going to remain high, but it'll be trending downward. Wealth levels will be improving, and they are concerned about the same thing everybody else is, what's going on with the federal government. Okay? But not a bad story. Business is in great shape. They paid down $2.9 trillion in the last 4 years. And corporate profits and cash flows have never been in better shape. Business is spending on equipment. About 2/3 of equipment is computers and softwares as they try to make their existing labor force more productive. They're not spending much on plant because there's a lot of excess capacity. We go back. You have to get a little more capacity utilization and much of the existing capacity used before there's really need to expand. And we're still lagging here. It'll take a little while longer. So overall, business is in great shape. Spending on equipment is going to continue to grow. Spending on plant will lag a little, but employment should continue to grow as well. That leaves the third leg of this thing, and that's the federal government. Okay? The federal government increased its debt by $5.8 trillion in the last 4 years, thereby wiping out the entire benefit of the deleveraging of the private sector. Now, I'm just going to go over some numbers here, just so when you hear what comes out of Washington, you'll have some reality. Right now, the U.S. borrows 34 cents out of every dollar it spends. So you have a dollar, you spend 66 cents, you borrow 34 cents. Here's the existing budget. $2.5 trillion in tax revenues, about 1.16 from individual income taxes, about $250 billion from corporate income taxes. The rest is Social Security and Medicare taxes, some unemployment insurance, and that's about it. Government is spending $3.8 trillion. Now, they have mandatory programs. Mandatory means we can't touch these, okay? That's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and TARP. That's $2.3 trillion, okay? Then there's interest on the debt, which is way low now because interest rates are so artificially low. And then everything else you know of this government. Security means every guy in uniform, defense, Homeland Security, CIA, FBI, Department of Energy, Department of Indian Affairs, Department of Agriculture, you name it, everything you generally think of as government is $1.3 trillion. Well, let's do some simple math. If you're spending 3.8, you're taking in 2.5, you have a $1.3 trillion deficit, which is almost identical to discretionary expenditures. Which means if you close down everything the government has, except for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and TARP, everything, every soldier was out of uniform, no more Department of Education, no more Department of Energy, no pay for Congress, it's a bad idea. You would barely have a balanced budget. That's what type of hole we're in. I also think you ought to know that the Obama budget calls for the deficit going from $16 trillion today to about $26 trillion by 2022. And that's assuming growth assumptions that are fairly optimistic. This is what it will look like. So, I also went back to 1900 and laid out what the deficit looked like. As you can see, we are not in normal times. Now, at what point does the rest of the world say, you know, thank you very much, we know you're the world's reserve currency, and we know that you're probably the safest place on the planet, but we don't want to buy your 30-year bonds at 2-point-something%. At what point does that happen? That's the point at which we have a problem. The problem is that nobody knows when this will happen. It's like the housing bubble, you knew it was there, but you didn't know when it was going to occur. Right? By the way, this does apply to this much. But I want you to know, despite all this, there is a zero chance, that we will ever default on our debt. Okay? I know that it's like AARP saying if you touch Social Security, we're going to stop sending 82-year-olds their checks. That's nonsense. Never going to happen. When Obama says, well, we're not a deadbeat nation, zero chance we're going to default on our debt. They'll actually have to cut somewhere else. And there's lots of places to cut. So what does the federal government need to do? Well, first admit there's a problem, and they barely do. Then you're going to deal with the problem, and I will tell you, everybody is going to be hurt. There is no easy way out of this. We're way past that point. Way past that point. So You need significant cuts in the rate of increase in these long-term programs for fiscal health. Not cuts in the absolute level, cuts in the rate of increase. Now, most of you know how your budgeting works. If you have a $100 budget this year and you have to cut, you need to cut from that $100 budget, not the government. If I have a $100 budget this year but had planned for a $150 budget next year and only get $120, that's a 20% cut. That's not a 20% increase. So when you hear cuts, they're talking from some fictitious number, not from the real actual spending. And that's a problem. But they're going to have to deal with that. There are going to be some tax increases, but they have to be designed so they don't hurt incentives. And that's a real problem right now. The real problem, though, is these things have to be phased in over an extended period of time. If they're not, you end up with the same problem you end up with in the fourth quarter. Defense spending goes down in the fourth quarter. The economy essentially is flat, no growth at all. You have to phase these in over a long period of time to assure the rest of the world that we know we have a problem, we're going to deal with it. Time will tell. By the way, this is individual income taxes as a percent of GDP. After the latest round of increases, we're back to the long-term trend. So we don't have a taxing problem in this country. What we have in this country is a spending problem. This is basically federal outlays as a percent of GDP, and that's way above normal. So it's not that we're not taxing enough, it's we're spending too much by historic standards. That's our reality. Now let me give you some numbers here. I'm not even going to comment on these because they're so self-evident. In 1930, the average life expectancy of a 20-year-old was 66 years. Today, it's 79 years. That's a 13-year increase in life expectancy. In 1934, the retirement age was 65, according to Social Security. Today, it's 67. Geez, I can't understand why we have a problem. Okay? Right now, there are 3 retirees, roughly 3 1/3 retirees for every employer, 3 1/3 workers for every retiree. By 2025 or so, it'll be 2 workers per retiree. So that's going to be really onerous on those people working. So it's a real issue. And then the final thing I want to mention is this. And again, I'm not going to draw any conclusions. This is healthcare spending, and it's the US, the UK, Spain, Sweden, and Germany. Okay? Other, a lot of socialized countries. And those lines are, until about 57 years old, are essentially convergent. And then we go in one direction and the rest of the world goes in the other. And that's just the reality of it. You can draw your own conclusion. So basically, state and local still under pressure, more revenues though available, federal spending is up but slow, and you need to avoid this fiscal cliff. I'm just going to go through this quickly. Can Europe cause a recession? No, it's not likely. And basically, let's go to Arizona. Right? Arizona's no longer happy birthday. Arizona and the U.S. tend to move together, and that's what's going on now. In 2006, we were second in job growth. By 2009, we were 49th. This last year, we were 5th. We made it basically all the way back. Virtually everything that's gone on here is transitory. And the reason they're not laughing at this because all those people were transitory, they weren't long enough to know who they were. Right. But the recovery is slow because you have a slow national recovery, because consumers are still restructuring, because of low levels of confidence, because there's a winding down in the defense sector, because we're winding out of Iraq and Afghanistan. But the real problem for us is population flows. People aren't coming here because they can't sell their house in Michigan, they can't sell their house in California, they can't get a loan, they can't move here. Right now, about 40% of all U.S. households are not mortgage creditworthy, and 22% nationally are still underwater. That compares to almost 40% in Arizona. Despite that, we have gone, again, from 49th in 2009 and 10 to 5th. So if you think it's slow here, how'd you like to be in the rest of the country? Again, Arizona employment is now growing. It should continue to grow. the fiscal cliff, if it were allowed to, the sequestration would have a major impact. In fact, this slide shows what the defense sector in Arizona would look like if the sequestration was allowed to take place. There'd be a problem, right? There have been two major studies done on the sequestration, and essentially Arizona, if it were allowed to take place, would lose 45 to 50,000 jobs. And that isn't a joke. So I don't think it'll take place, but that's what the effect would be. Employment, there's only 3 minor sectors that are still down for the state. Everything else is growing, even manufacturing, even construction. And as over the last 6 months, we've created, or 12 months, we've created 64,000 jobs. 12 months before that, 23,000. 12 months before that, 7. 12 months before that, we lost 160,000 jobs. It's that movement from losing 160 to gaining 64,000 that feels good. It's a lot better than it was. And as the speaker pointed out, we lost 300,000 jobs, and we're only about a third of the way back. So we got some room to go. It'll be the end of 2015 before they're all the way back. Relative to everyone else, except ourselves, we're doing great. Relative to the recoveries we're used to having, this is really mediocre. This shows the first 41 months of this recovery compared to the 41 months of the previous 4 recoveries. Again, percentage terms, it's real slow, and that is what you're seeing. But again, in relative terms, we're doing great. Phoenix has gone from being dead last in 2010 in terms of major employment markets. There are 25 major employment markets in this country. A major employment market has more than 1 million jobs. Phoenix went from being dead last in 2010 to being 3rd in 2012. So again, it was a mediocre recovery for Arizona, for Phoenix and for Arizona, but relative to everybody else, we're doing just fine. Now, there are some estimates for population, which is expected to continue to grow, and for employment. The reason I throw these up there is because at this point in time, nobody knows what population growth is going to be. And the reason is, nobody knows at what point people have enough equity in their house and feel confident enough, and mortgage markets free up enough so they can start to move. That's a major problem for us, especially for Prescott, a retirement area. And for that to happen, those 3 things have to happen. Housing prices have to continue to go up, people have to feel better, and they have to have credit. They have to be able to get mortgages to move here. That's slow. And so we think population growth will improve, but it's going to be very low by historic standards. Nationally, we took a look at, these are 5-year increments of people moving in the U.S. And the blue is people moving from a different county in a state to a different, from one state, county, in a state to another, but within the same state. The red is from a different state to another state, and the green is essentially from abroad. And as you can see, this is the lowest rate of movement the U.S. has had since the data was kept, which is 1965. And that has to change. According to SRP, this is net residential utility hookups. This goes back to 2003, and while we're off the bottom, it's still only around 1%, where about 3 to 4 is the norm. Excuse me, that's APS. APS, this data goes back to 1954. And as you can see, how the 2010-11 period and into 2012 were the weakest years on record for net residential utility hookups. It's tough, and it will be for a while longer. Yavapai County, the good news is, after 4 years where you probably wanted to commit suicide, things have turned around. You're growing again. Good news. And essentially, the federal government's down. Everything else is up. The other thing, if I get this to work, retail sales are finally turned positive. This is not the recovery you would expect. Historically, the deeper the recession, the stronger the recovery. That hasn't happened this time around. So there's a lot of pent-up demand out there. And as somebody talked about housing, at least housing permits are up after 4 really weak years. Well, again, the real estate market you wanted, the real estate market you got. With that, it's very difficult not to be optimistic about housing. I'm going to use some Phoenix figures here before we talk about Yavapai County, just to give you some figure, some idea of what's going on. Listings in MLS, way down. Month supply, way down. Distressed inventory, way, way down. Still high, but way down. Get this to work. Foreclosure notices, really way down. You're only slightly above normal, quite frankly. The total pending foreclosures, way down. Percentage of sales that are not distressed, normal sales, way up. This is over 60% as right now. So we're making a recovery there. Total vacant units, we're almost back to normal. We've eaten through a lot of that excess inventory. Sales prices, way up. And the number of active subdivisions, in Phoenix, it's way down. And all that means is that builders are going to be scrambling for land and they'll be putting up models. There are, in a market like Phoenix with more than 2 million homes, there are a total of 900 spec homes at this point, which is like nothing. So virtually every indicator is positive. But housing is not a light switch. It's not like somebody flicks a switch. It's like a dimmer switch. And the lights are getting brighter and brighter and will continue to get brighter over the next several years. Now think of what's going on in the housing market. If you're in business and you've got a manufacturer, you've got a retail store, think about what happens when you find yourself with a really big supply of inventory. You bought a bunch of things that you thought were going to sell. They didn't. What do you do with them? You put them on sale and you keep on cutting the price until the inventory moves off the shelf. Once the inventory moves off the shelf, sale's over. All right? Prices go back up. That's the housing market. That's exactly what's going on now. And again, the sale is ending. For Phoenix, permits were up 71%. For Tucson, they were up 41%. And for Prescott, they were up 41% last year. Still very low, but you're moving in the right direction. And again, you're only about 9% of the peak, but you're going to be moving in the right direction. And that's probably the best news I can talk to you about. We expect housing permits to continue to grow at least through 2015 or 16, and things will get better and better. Prices have gone up a lot. In Phoenix, resale prices are up a third. New home prices are up almost 10%. Tucson up 27%. And interestingly enough, in Prescott Valley, they're up about 19%, and Prescott about 10%. So housing prices are moving in the right direction, and that tells me your market is clearing rather quickly. The price gains are really in distressed properties. That's where the major price gains have been. The properties that nobody wanted a year or two ago, that were bought by investors, that's where the price is. But as supply diminishes and demand increases, all properties will benefit. And we think that housing prices still have about 40% to run before you get back to normal for existing housing prices. Home ownership rates are down, way down, and they'll probably come back a little, not a lot. Let me just skip to this one. Right now, nationally, only about 2/3 of all homeowners have an LTV of less than 90%. The other third is out of the housing market entirely because they're simply underwater or they don't have enough equity to sell. Also, and you don't know how this crosses over, about 40% of households are not creditworthy, at least not mortgage creditworthy. That means to me that the housing market is not playing with a full deck. It's like playing with 27 or 28 cards. Until people have enough equity in their homes and credit markets free up, you're not going to get a normal housing market. And that is still probably 3 years away. And that's when population growth will really take off. Let's see. All right, you get a knock at this door. It's not. This has nothing to do with you, Andy, but you knock at your door and this horrible thing happens. Your kid wants to move back in. And that simply is because they can't launch. They can't find a job. They can't find a roommate with a job. So what happens is they move back home. Well, this is the percentage of people between 25 and 34 who are living with mommy and daddy. It's gone from 36% to 43%. Right, that's creating huge pent-up demand. And when the economy does get stronger, not only will housing benefit from the fact that more people will be moving here, but there'll be a huge increase in household formations as these people find jobs and launch. So I'm actually very optimistic about the housing market over the next 3-4 years. Let's see. So the last issue, again, I'm almost done here. Population is the one thing, is the one unknown that, in terms of the timing, but things should get progressively better. We are on the right track. The housing market has not recovered, nor has the economy, but we are recovering. How's this all going to turn out? By the way, I threw the next one in. I threw the next one in not because it says anything, but because I thought it was funny. That's funny. All right. The economy is improving in absolute and relative terms. Like it or not, the glass is still half full. Growth is going to be slow by historic standards because the U.S. economy is slow and because the incentives being created by Washington can only be considered perverse. That's the reality of the world we live in. The economy should gain momentum, again, unless the government does something incredibly stupid, and that remains to be seen. By the way, I had a picture of a couple of senators who were negotiating on a fiscal cliff, and I want to point out to you that there's a boom out there somewhere. The basic dynamics haven't changed, but the boom is not in 2013. However, 2013 will be better. Will be better than 2012. 2014 will be better than 2013, and 2015 should be the year that you really enjoy. Thanks a lot.